Let's talk about the Sphinx for a couple minutes. I know Robert Schoch has done some incredible work on that with the
Yes.
erosion on the Temple of the Sphinx. What is some of the evidence that the Sphinx is a much older monument?
Well, the Sphinx is, I mean, it's fascinating. It's one of the, I love that monument. I've had the chance to be down in the enclosure a couple times, get up close to it. There's several different lines of evidence and ways of thinking about the Sphinx that sort of point towards that. One is obviously the fact that it seems likely that its head has been recarved, right? Anyone that looks at it and sees it, you'll notice the head's kind of out of proportion to the body. It's a little small relative to the body. The dynastic Egyptians were masters of proportion and sculpture. They've made beautiful works of art. This wouldn't have been a deliberate choice by them, but perhaps it's the result of them recarving the head, and it may have been something else. A lot of people have theorized that maybe the head was that of a lion. And so there's astronomical evidence when you look at it's facing east, so facing the sunrise. And if in there's a people may or may not know about the great year or the concept of precession, the precession of the equinoxes, right? So it's one of the many cycles of the Milankovitch cycles that the planet goes through. But where the sun rises on the summer solstice, it's under which constellation defines what age we're in. So today we're in the age of Pisces. So generally, when the sun rises on that solstice, it's okay. We're under Pisces. We're slowly moving into the age of Aquarius. It's a precession of the equinox. It goes backwards through the constellations, and it's a funny study. That whole area of the zodiac that goes back through time and culture. It's very common. It goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. In fact, it's well documented in ancient Egypt. The zodiac's all over the Temple of Dendera, a very famous version of a stone of the zodiac. It's actually housed in the Louvre today, but not only in at the Dendera in that one area, but it's actually plastered all along the tops of these amazing, all entirely dynastic temples. So they were well aware of this. So I guess they got the idea from somewhere. But so some people have theorized that perhaps if it was a lion and it was pointing due east, and perhaps the constellation under which that it may have been aiming at might have been Leo, the lion, which is it's a connection between that constellation and a lion that's been in place for a long time. And again, this strange thing with the zodiac, it does have these correlations between cultures and time. Then perhaps that indicates an age of around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Because the
You'll be
precession of the
Christ.
equinoxes is 26,000 year cycle. So each age is like 2,500 years. Roughly, some constellations are wider than others. So that's one potential avenue of evidence that suggests, well, if it was a lion, then maybe it's a marker to potentially indicate, hey, I was built to symbolize the age of Leo. At least in the last precessional cycle, it could actually be, you go back 10,000 years or 12 to 10 or 12,000 years to that period of time, like say 10,000 BC, it could be 26,500 years older than that. We don't know. Like each precessional cycle is 26, roughly 26,000 years, a little more. The other one that's probably more well known, that's been the debate that you mentioned, Robert Schoch, and we should also remember the great John Anthony West, who kind of theorized this idea in the first place, and then invited Robert Schoch, who's a professor of geology from Boston University, so a real expert when it comes to the sort of topics that we'll get into, is the erosion that is shown on the Sphinx. Not only on the Sphinx, but probably more importantly, the Sphinx enclosure. So for people that don't know. So the Sphinx is not they didn't build it. It's carved from the bedrock.
Mhm.
It's actually the remnants of what you would call a yardang, which is like a limestone outcrop. But in order to carve it, they actually cut down into the bedrock. They created this enclosure. And in fact, a lot of the blocks that seem to have been part of like the Valley Temple, there's actually like blocks like 150, 200 tons. They've come from the Sphinx enclosure. They carved down and then they carved along and then they shaped it from the actual bedrock. So it's not built so much as carved from the bedrock. The Sphinx has been repaired over time, right? So there's actually evidence for Old Kingdom repairs, and there's a stone, the Khufu's daughter's stone, or it was also sometimes known as the inventory stele, that gets dismissed as a hoax, as false news, I guess, by by a lot of Egyptologists, because it talks of Khufu. Because they're going to remember that the Sphinx is attributed to Khafra, right? Khafra of the Middle Pyramid complex, who was the son of Khufu. Khufu is the Great Pyramid. This is the orthodox dating for it. The people like to attribute the Sphinx to Khafra because it seems to be part of that middle pyramid complex, which more or less gets associated to Khafra. There's actually very little evidence to support this. It doesn't matter. But I just want to say there is a later stele, the stele of Khufu's daughter, they call it, and it also called the inventory stele that talks about Khafra. Khufu, so Khafra's father, making repairs to the Sphinx. So before it was even built, apparently Khufu was repairing it. And there's some evidence for Old Kingdom repairs on the body of the Sphinx. Then there's later, like Thutmose IV repaired it, and then the Romans repaired it, and it's been repaired in the industrial age, it's been repaired in the modern age.
So they're repairing it how close to after the time that it was built?
I don't know when it was built, but this is actually an account of it being repaired before it was supposed to have been built.
Okay.
So I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. If I was an Egyptologist, I'd probably go, "Yeah, that's nonsense." But I think it's more of an indication of and there is actually on the body of it. You look like there is what I think is Old Kingdom repair work. You can still see it. It matches other Old Kingdom repair work. So if it was built in the Old Kingdom, why are you repairing it straight away? Like, what's the point? And I think it's old. I think there's tremendous evidence. I, in fact, think the entire Middle Pyramid complex is older. I think that may even be the oldest structure there. But so what my point is that you can't use the body of the Sphinx to really determine things like erosion. Now, the nice thing about the enclosure is that nobody's really done anything to the enclosure. They've carved a few caves into it here and there. But the walls of the enclosure essentially haven't been touched. They haven't been repaired. There actually have been some fissures repaired here and there, but in general, it's pretty original. So what's interesting about it is that you can look at the patterns on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure and determine things like erosion. And Robert Schoch came along and looked at it as an expert geologist and said that's rainfall erosion, like these vertical fissures that you see. You see these horizontal fissures in the walls, but that's more to do with the different layers of limestone. It's a sedimentary rock, so it gets laid down in layers, and some layers are harder than others, so it erodes at different rates, leaves these horizontal striations over time. But there are vertical fissures on the wall too, and he's like, that's rainfall erosion. Now, everybody knows Egypt's a bit of a desert. I mean, I've seen it rain there. It's infrequent, but in order to get that type of erosion on those walls, you're talking about thousands of years of quite heavy rainfall. And you have to go back to periods of time like 9,000 years ago and more, when Egypt was green and verdant and more tropical, and there was rain. But you have to go back even further because it takes thousands of years of rain to get that type of erosion. Now, there's lots of debate about this and argument because it upsets the apple cart about the story of history. But it's tough to argue with. If you ever took a picture of, take a picture of that of that section of the wall of limestone. Remove the context. Don't tell anyone that this is Egypt or the Sphinx enclosure, and show it to your geologist. 9 times out of 10, probably more, they're going to say, well, that's rainfall erosion on limestone. So there's all sorts of wacky ideas and debates that people are trying to use to justify other explanations. Things like a lot of times I like to say, well, it's wind and sand erosion. See, it's sand and wind. And I hate this argument because, for one, you give the Sphinx 10 years, 15 years without it being maintained, the thing fills up to its chest in sand. Like the enclosure gets buried very quickly. This has happened time and time again in our records. We have tons of, you go back, look at old photos of the Sphinx, buried up to here. And it's literally happened between excavations. Like there's been excavations, someone finishes, they clear it all out, and then 10 years later, the next guy comes in and goes, I've got a year of work trying to clear all this sand out again because it just fills up. It happened during the dynastic. The Romans had to dig it out. Thutmose IV had to dig it out. That's the whole dream stele that's between the legs of the Sphinx. It tells the story of Thutmose IV, who fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and had a dream. And the Sphinx said, "Hey, dig me up and you'll become king. Like, clean me off, Yeah. So but the one part. What's the one part that doesn't get buried?
The head.
The head.
Right. Is there evidence to suggest that the Sphinx head was the only thing that was sticking out during the time of the Egyptians?
Well, I think for long periods of time, I'm sure that's what was going on. Yeah. My point about it is that if you're saying that it's wind and sand erosion on the enclosure buried, the part that is always buried, so it must have had enough exposure to wind and sand. And of course, mainstream Egyptologists, it's the mainstream story, they don't talk about the Sphinx's head being recarved. It's all OG, right? but the part of the Sphinx that is always exposed to wind and sand,
It's the head.
the head, do you see any? There's no erosion like that on the head. Like, and the head hasn't been. I mean, there's been some modern concrete repair to shore up the neck, but in general, they haven't like been touching up the head. You just don't. It's limestone. You don't see the same erosion on the head. It's this reverse contradiction, like reverse logic. This contradiction in the story that is so common when you dig into the details of this story, and it's just you just have to sort of dig in a bit and not believe what you're told on in the first account, and you'll easily find these sort of contradictions. That's a big one for me. So, yeah, I think the wind and sand erosion is a big problem. There's another aspect to this as well that I've actually had a really interesting conversation with Randall Carlson on, where there's been studies done into rates of limestone erosion. So not only can we look at the rainfall erosion, but we can actually look at the rates of erosion in the walls themselves, which we know are generally original. And there's been many, many studies done into this for the last 80, 90 years, where they've looked at limestone on coasts that are affected by wave action, limestone under all sorts of different circumstances, alkaline, acidic environments, all this sort of stuff. So you can take those studies and apply what we see to the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. And once again, you come back with figures that are like, damn, this might be 50,000 years old, like just looking at the erosional patterns. So there's a ton of evidence that suggests the Sphinx is much older.